Hello there. This is the beginning of Unit 3 called Democracy Tested. And we're starting with the 3.01 lesson. Unseen problems in the nation's economy ended in the 1920s boom and pushed the United States into the worst economic depression in history. America's turned to Franklin Roosevelt. FDR, as he's commonly called, introduced more government programs than any other president, changing forever the way Americans thought about government. But the New Deal didn't end the Great Depression. Only when World War II began in Europe and the United States joined the Allies after the attack at Pearl Harbor did the economy fully recover. FDR was elected twice more as heroic efforts from men and women of all races and backgrounds finally ended the carnage and brought victory. The United States had become the world's most powerful nation. Lesson 1, the bubble burst, starting with the Great Depression. Crash, recession, depression, catastrophe. During the 1920s, business boomed and things seemed to be going well. But appearances were deceptive, and in late 1929, the bottom dropped out of the stock market, unemployment grew, and poverty spread across America. Greed played a part in bringing about the economic crisis. So did rampant speculation. Whatever the causes, the bubble had burst. Goals for this lesson: identify the major causes of the stock market crash of 1929 and the Great Depression, describe the plight of farmers during the 20s and 30s, and recognize the immediate effects of the stock market crash and depression on American society. Make sure to go to lesson resources, get your reading guide and your lesson answer key, and let's begin. Read pages 370 to 679, complete the reading guide, complete the dollar drops activity, and complete the checkpoint at the end. So let's go to page 670, and that's just the beginning of the chapter, so we'll actually start with 672. The Great Depression begins. The year 1929 seemed to be the high water mark of the Roaring Twenties. In his inaugural address, the newly elected president, Herbert Hoover, confidently affirmed, "I have no fears for the future of our country. It is bright with hope." At the New York Stock Exchange, the nation's major institution for the systematic buying and selling of securities, such as stocks, bonds, and other investments, the value of stocks kept going up and up. Americans appeared to be more prosperous than ever before, but much of that affluence was an illusion. As the stock market overheated, President Hoover expressed concerns about the orgy of mad speculation. On Monday, September 3, 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a leading measure of the stock market strength, reached a record high. 2 days later, Roger Babson, a leading stock market analyst, warned that sooner or later a crash is coming, and it may be terrific. Factories will shut down, and men will be thrown out of work. When word of Babson's forecast reached the New York Stock Exchange, securities traders panicked. They started selling whatever stocks and bonds they could to get out of the market while prices were still high. With people more eager to sell than to buy, stock prices began to decline. On October 24th, known forever as Black Thursday, a stampede of selling began. It peaked on Tuesday, October 29th. On that day, called Black Tuesday, investors dumped more than 16 million shares of stock. Over the next 2 years, the United States fell deeper and deeper into an economic catastrophe known as the Great Depression. By 1932, 9 million people lost their life savings when banks failed. Nearly a quarter of the workforce was unemployed. In industrial cities like Cleveland, up to half the people were jobless. The growing ranks of the unemployed and homeless waited in long lines to get meals from charity soup kitchens. The economic catastrophe spread around the globe, most notably to Europe and Japan. The stock market crash of 1929 was the first clear signal the wealth of the 1920s had been built on shaky and ultimately unsustainable foundations. When these foundations crumbled, the nation plummeted into one of the darkest periods in American history. And yet, while the Great Depression was a time of enormous hardship, it was also an era of political initiative. Americans embraced new solutions to unforeseen problems and came to accept a new role for government in American life. Nobody was prepared for the Great Depression, and nobody emerged from it unchanged. Look at the graph here, the stock market from December 1928 to December 1930. You see that big peak there in 1929, and then down, and then a little up, but down, 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 continuing down. The stock market crash. Oh, wait a minute. The causes of the Great Depression. Just as a combination of natural phenomenon, cold fronts, pockets of moisture in the air, wind currents, and temperature changes come together to create a storm, so too do many factors converge to cause the perfect economic storm of the Great Depression. Historians continue to debate the details, but generally agree on several main factors. Number 1, the stock market crash. The stock market crash in 1929 had such devastating effects because the market had risen so high and therefore had a long way to fall. The market was riding a bubble, a state of frenzied economic activity that, like a soap bubble, can rise high but quickly pop. In the economy, a bubble happens when many people engage in speculation, pouring money into risky investments in hope of big gains. People take the risk because they believe the value will never stop rising and therefore think they must keep buying at any cost. Steadily rising stock prices during the 1920s led many investors to believe that the market was a safe, solid place for investment. Investors were sure they could never lose money. They were confident they could always sell their stocks at a greater price than they had paid for them. As the bubble took shape, many investors bought stock on margin. That is, they paid cash for only a small fraction of the price of the stock they were acquiring and borrowed to cover the remaining balance. Among similar lines, businessmen started companies called investment trusts that bought stock on credit. As if the system were not already shaky enough, individuals also bought stock in the investment trust companies. In effect, they borrowed money to buy shares in companies that were themselves borrowing money to buy stock. As long as stock prices rose, individual investors in the trust companies could repay their loans and still realize a profit. But if stock prices were to fall, the system would collapse like a house of cards and leave millions of stockholders deep in debt. In the days leading up to the Black Thursday, people began to realize there was little money left to borrow. Moreover, an abundance of easy credit had lifted the price of corporate stocks far beyond what the companies were really worth. For example, the price of General Motors stock more than doubled from $99 a share in 1925 to $212 in 1928, not because the company was earning greater profits, but mostly due to rampant speculation. Optimism turned to panic as investors realized they had borrowed more than they could ever repay to buy shares in companies that weren't worth their inflated prices. As investors began selling their shares, the bubble popped and the market collapsed. Today, many middle-class and working-class families have a stake in the stock market with pension and retirement savings accounts invested in stocks and bonds. But this was not the case in 1929 when roughly 2% of Americans owned stock. Thus, most people did not stand to lose directly from the collapse of the stock market. But the crash did cause many businesses and banks to fail, and when businesses and banks went under, many people suffered. Cause number 2, crisis in the farm sector. Even in the era of flappers, Fords, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, life in much of rural America remained stuck in an earlier time. As late as 1930, 45 million rural Americans had no indoor plumbing. Few had electricity. They lived in a world of oil lamps, outhouses, and wood stoves. Despite the generally rising prosperity in the 20s, most rural Americans lived lives of grinding hardship. Many of the poorest Americans lived on farms where almost none of the prosperity of the 1920s reached them. When World War I began, American farmers had jumped at the chance to produce more and sell crops to European countries that had necessarily shifted their efforts from growing crops to fighting battles. After peace came in 1918, Europe was once again able to feed itself, and American farmers were left with large surpluses. With too much food available, prices plummeted. Corn, for instance, dropped from $1.50 to only 52 cents a bushel. Individual farmers sought to make up for lost income by increasing their output, but this only made matters worse, further increasing the crop surplus and thus pushing prices even lower. At the same time, farmers faced their own credit crisis. Most farmers had to borrow money to buy seed, fertilizer, and supplies each year. As prices dropped, farmers were unable to repay their loans and fell further into debt. Thus, the farm sector was already in a state of deep economic crisis with a decade before the rest of the nation fell into the Great Depression. Another cause, falling purchasing power, rising unemployment. In 1929, even though the American economy was richer than ever before, most of the wealth was concentrated at the top. There was a huge economic gap between the wealthy few and the working class many. Just 5% of Americans held more than 30% of all personal income in the country, while at least 40% of families lived in poverty and had trouble affording food and shelter. This economic inequality helped bring about a decline in purchasing power. With so little of the nation's wealth in their pockets, working class and farm families could only afford to buy so much. During the 1920s, many middle-class families had used credit to purchase washing machines, automobiles, and other durable goods that they could not otherwise afford. As consumers reached the limits of their credit, they could not buy more or afford to replace the items they already owned. By 1927, purchases of appliances and other durable goods declined, which put manufacturers in a bind. Many manufacturers had taken out loans to build new factories and purchase new equipment. The decline in consumer purchasing left manufacturers with surplus inventory and no means of paying their debts. The decline in purchasing power severely affected the automotive sector. As demand for new cars plunged at the end of the decade, automobile companies slowed down production and many workers lost their jobs. The companies also canceled orders for steel, rubber, glass, and oil, materials needed to make and power cars. In turn, these industries began laying off employees by the thousands. As workers lost their jobs and incomes, they stopped buying most products, which in turn forced more businesses to lay off workers or close down altogether. See, it's a big circle. One thing affects many other aspects. This situation repeated itself in nearly every industrial sector in the country, leading to a massive crisis of unemployment. In Chicago, 5 people applied for every 2 jobs. In the spring of 1932, 3,000 auto workers marched in protest against layoffs at a Ford plant in Dearborn, Michigan. Similar scenes occurred in other industries. The banking crisis, another cause for the Great Depression. Those Americans in the 20s who did have money had a hard time keeping it safe. The nation had thousands of banks, but few rules governed how they were run. Most governments and business leaders assumed that the recently created Federal Reserve Board was providing more than enough oversight of the nation's banking and money lending system. But in keeping with the prevalent hands-off economic policies of the time, the Federal Reserve had exercised little control over credit and lending. One way a bank earns a profit is by making loans, lending the money deposited in the bank and earning interest on those loans. Banks usually lend more money than they keep on deposit, but if they stay within reasonable limits, they are unlikely to fail. In the 1920s, however, many banks were lending far more money than was reasonable. They were also making unwise loans to individual investors and trust companies that used the bank's money to speculate on the stock market. All these risky loans put the banks in danger. For one thing, if many borrowers lost their jobs and incomes, the banks stood to lose big, since unemployed borrowers would not be able to repay their loans. For another, if enough people at once suddenly wanted to withdraw the funds they had deposited in a bank, the bank would not have enough money to pay out. The bank would then go out of business and the depositors would lose their savings. That is precisely what happened at the end of the decade. In 1929, when the stock market crashed, people everywhere rushed to the banks and tried to get a hold of their savings. Those who closed their accounts at the start of this bank run got their money. Those who didn't lost their life savings. More than 650 banks failed in 1929 alone, and thousands more failed in the following years. The run on the banks even threatened banks that had not overextended their resources. When one institution went under, panicky depositors tried to pull their money out of the other banks, creating a domino effect. During a single month in 1930, 129 southern banks closed their doors. When the Bank of the United States, a large private institution in New York City, failed, roughly 400,000 depositors lost their savings. And here we see this picture here. Crowds form outside the Brooklyn branch of the Bank of the United States as it closes its doors. As banks failed, many lost their life savings. And then going back to the last page, this picture to me really epitomizes a lot of the suffering of the Great Depression. I know 3 trades, I speak 3 languages, fought for 3 years, I have 3 children and no work for 3 months, but I only want one job. Okay, another reason, international economics. A tangled set of international economic circumstances also helped trigger the Great Depression. At the end of World War I, a defeated Germany was ordered by the victorious Allies to pay the huge bill of $33 billion for the damages it had done. But Germany was bankrupt, so it turned to the richest nation in the world at the time, the United States. Germany got the money to pay its war reparations mainly by borrowing heavily from the American banks and lenders. As Germany paid off allied nations such as France and Britain, these countries used the reparations to pay their own wartime debts to the United States, which meant the American banks and the American government were lending out money so they could be paid back what they were owed. European nations were simply borrowing more and more to try to get out of debt. To make matters worse, in 1922, Congress raised tariffs, taxes on imported goods, which made it harder for struggling European countries to sell their products to Americans. By raising tariffs, Congress intended to encourage Americans to buy American-made goods, and thus help the nation become self-sufficient. But the result was to raise prices, stifle international trade, and slow down Europe's economic recovery. And we'll stop this video here and begin the next one with the Great Depression.